3, 2, 1, action. Welcome to the Hóčhoka podcast.
Hello, Mataki Ape. Welcome to Hóčhoka here at the center of the St. Joe's Indian School campus. I am Scott Wooster, today's host for the Hóčhoka podcast. We're glad that you've all joined our circle today, and I'm also especially glad that I have with me today Damian Costello.
Hi, Scott.
Hi.
Great to be here. I am the Director of Postgraduate Studies at NAITS, an Indigenous Learning Community.
Okay.
And that's a ATS-accredited, Indigenous-run theological school. So we grant master's degrees, and now we have a PhD.
Okay. And you're in charge of that school there.
I'm on the admin team. I would definitely not say I'm in charge.
Okay.
I'm one of the voices supporting their work, but I take the lead on the doctoral program.
Okay.
Yeah.
And based out of Montpelier?
No,
Vermont?
actually, we're sort of nowhere.
Okay.
We exist in the virtual world.
Okay.
We have an office in Prince Edward Island, Atlantic Canada.
Okay.
But we deliver everything online to reach our students as far away as Australia now, Philippines, and New Zealand.
Okay. And you yourself are based in Montpelier.
Yes.
That's your home turf.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're going to be talking quite a bit today about Nicholas Black Elk, and you played a role in basically the cause for his sainthood. And so we want to know a little bit more about that here at Hóčhoka. And Nicholas Black Elk is a well-known Hóčhoka, or he's a well-known holy man of the Lakota people. His Lakota name is Hóčhoka Sapa, I believe. Is that correct? Am I saying that right?
Mm-hmm.
How did you come to know him so well, or what's your connection to Black Elk?
I got to know him, I think, how most people got to know him up until a couple years ago through the famous book Black Elk Speaks.
Yep.
I was avoiding my homework in college and found it on the shelf and read it, and I just loved it. And then I brought it into a theology course I was taking, and the teacher saw it, and he said, "Oh, Damian, that's a great book, isn't it?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "You know, he was Catholic." And I had no idea. That was nothing I had ever thought about. I wasn't reading it because I thought he was Catholic, or it was just a great story.
Right.
And so he said, "Oh, you should do a project on that." And so that was how I first got interested and started to learn about what was just a fascinating life.
People have talked a little bit about Europeans discovering indigenous peoples. They came over from Europe and found the New World. There's a different twist on that, is the indigenous people and what they found in the Europeans as they came across. Is that something that you've thought a lot about?
That really sort of switched everything around for me, right? I was in high school in 1992, and we were really sort of looking at that legacy of Columbus and very tragic history. And we focused a lot on the tragedy, which is a big part of the story, right? We don't ever want to whitewash that.
Right.
However, there's a big part of the story of how natives engaged this new world, how they were proactive, how they discovered things, used them for their own survival, and found beauty and power in them. And so if you look at the same history with that perspective, how did indigenous people discover the New World, or European culture, European traditions? A whole other facet of history opens up.
Mm-hmm.
And with Black Elk, we can look at the question of Christianity, right? We think of Christianity, and there's a lot of truth to this, that was brought by missionaries. In a lot of cases, it was forced on native peoples. Well, there's a hidden history of natives who sought out Christianity or Christian thought, and encountered it on their own terms and saw it as a vibrant path that helped them to negotiate a very difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. What I hear you saying is that we had native peoples who were seeking out Christianity long before the forced residential schools or the forced boarding schools, and some of that Christianity was forced on them. Is that right?
Yeah, you wouldn't want to say that it was super widespread or that was the most dominant perspective, but there are very important examples of people and groups who did seek out Christian ways of life and engage them. And this happened before their encounter with the residential schools. And one of the tragedies from a church perspective is that the residential schools actually kind of wiped out what was a very vibrant encounter already in service of the government program. But if you look at this part of the country, right, if you look at the Dakotas and the northern Great Plains, we had Jesuits running around, Father Pierre de Smet, who was passing through the plains because a group of natives, the Mountain Salish, or they're also known as the Flathead, had encountered Mohawk traders, Mohawk trappers who were working for the Northwest Company. And these were Catholic Mohawks. They had been for generations now. This is St. Kateri's people. And we don't really know exactly how the conversation went because there were no anthropologists or annoying missionaries there writing down everything that happened. But the Flathead heard about the Catholic way from these Mohawks and said, hey, we could use that. We don't even know exactly what they thought about it, why it was attractive, but they made 4 journeys to St. Louis to ask, send us some black robes. That's a long ways.
Yeah, it
right?
is. Absolutely, yeah.
You're from this area, it's not an easy journey. And so finally, Father de Smet said, okay, I'll go. This is about, I think, 1840. And so he crosses the plains, and in that journey, one of his journeys, he encounters Sitting Bull during the Great Sioux Wars. And so in the midst of this conflict, de Smet goes into his camp unarmed, only some Lakota guides with him, and smokes the pipe with Sitting Bull and gives him his rosary. And so if you look at the pictures of Sitting Bull from when he was in the Wild West show, he's wearing that rosary that de Smet gave him. And so long story short is when Red Cloud asked for black robes to come and teach their kids when they were finally imprisoned on the reservations, when they realized we have to survive in the white world, they said, well, those black robes and the way they talk about what they talked about, if someone's going to teach our kids, it's going to be them. So there's this process in which, in this difficult situation, Native peoples see Christian ideas and Christian people as being something that can help them to survive. Did it always work out that way? Definitely not.
Right.
But we can uncover ways in which it did contribute to their well-being, to Native people's well-being.
Right. I appreciate the background and how that looked with missionaries and Christianity, the fur traders, and Father de Smet. How did that all look to Black Elk?
Well, the fascinating thing I think about Black Elk and why I think he's such an important figure for the relationship between Christianity and Native Americans is that he found all the important things about sort of an authentic Native American Christianity before he ever encountered any outside missionaries. And the first place that happened was in Europe. He came back to Pine Ridge from Canada. He had gone up with Sitting Bull and spent 4 years there, and he came back, and that's when he finally accepted his vision. And on the way back to Pine Ridge, he became a healer, and he worked as a healer for a number of years, and then had the opportunity to go travel with Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And it's a very complicated thing to talk about because, of course, here we are, we're bringing Native peoples around and we're, putting them on display from one perspective and coming from a very unfree place. But it also seems as if this was an opportunity. They were paid very well. They got to see the world, which they definitely no longer were able to do back on the reservation. And they got to inhabit their culture in an authentic way. Like, you got to be publicly native, the exact opposite of what was happening back in the reservation. Very paradoxical. But Black Elk said, if I'm going to go see the world and see if there's anything of value that the white man has that I can bring back to my people, any power that can help us to survive. This was part of his role as a holy person. So for 3 years, he traveled the East Coast. He went to Europe, London, the biggest city in the world at the time, and he was a great dancer. He danced for the Queen, fell in love in Paris, talked about bringing his girlfriend back. But he and the rest of the performers, the native performers, investigated Christianity. So you had, of course, lots of preachers and missionary types who are very interested in sharing the good news with the natives. But from all the accounts, they were very proactive in investigating this themselves. Mm-hmm. They went to a big church in London. I think it was Westminster Abbey in Redchurch, which is a town on the northern side of Pine Ridge, named after Redchurch, had a vision in the church that he took to be the same as any vision you would get in Hamblecha in the Vision Quest. 40 Lakota performers went to a congregational church, and they sang in Lakota a hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," which is like the biggest Protestant hymn of the time. It had been translated into Dakota and had been started migrating out to the Lakota people too. And so they sang this to the congregation. They were blown away. Like, how do they know this hymn, and how are they doing this in their own language? They would go to church. They wintered in Glasgow. This is a trip later than after Black Elk had gone. And they said, the natives were free to go to whatever church they would, and they'd show up all the time in these different churches. And there was a pastor's wife, I believe it was, who said their appetite for hymns was insatiable. They'd want copies of hymns to bring back. And so in the Lakota way, we know that the songs it's the language of the spirits. And so from that perspective, they're getting these new songs for the spirits that are around them there. Mm-hmm. So Black Elk's case, what's really interesting, we have a couple letters that he sends back where he describes this investigation. He says, man, this is a really strange place. You don't see the sun for a couple months at a time. Mm-hmm. But there's one good thing. It's what they talk about God. They have faith in God. And I've learned something from that. And then he gets back after 3 years, and he writes this letter in Lakota to all the people. This was in the Episcopal Lakota language newspaper. And he reports on his journey. Again, he says, this was a very difficult way of life. I was gone for 3 years. I didn't find anything that could help our people except this one thing. And he quotes 1 Corinthians 13. And so if you're anybody who's ever been to a Christian wedding, that's the kind of passage that would get quoted. It's Paul's great epistle on love. You can have everything. You can cure everyone. You can prophesy. It doesn't matter if you don't have love. And he says, I live that way now, and we all should. And I wanted to go to the Holy Land and find and see where this holy man lived, but I couldn't. It was too far away. And so, I think a lot of people who sort of authentically engage Christianity would say that's kind of the heart of the message, right? If there's something good there, that's what you'd find. And that's what he found through his own words and his own effort.
Right. Mm-hmm. And was able to seek it out on his own instead of having it forced on him. He went out and explored and found that on his own.
Mm-hmm. And, to put this in a Lakota context, the most Lakota of ceremonies is the Sundance, right? Mm-hmm. But we forget that wasn't always a Lakota ceremony, right? And Black Elk tells the story himself that when the people first came out to the plains, they started getting weak, and they were sort of falling away. And he tells the story of Kablaya having this vision of the Sundance, and that was what would renew the people on the plains, that there was this new ceremony that would give new life to the people in a new context. And so if we take that sort of broad perspective and we look at, okay, what's going on with Black Elk and his search for new power in this radically new world where there's all these different people that had never been heard of before, that maybe this is the new power in some sense that would help them to thrive in part in this new situation.
So I'm understanding that Black Elk, was part of Sitting Bull's camp for years. He went to the Wild West show in Europe. He was able to kind of marry the Christianity ideology at that point, right? But where was he before this? I mean, was he a healer even before he went to Europe, or how did that look for him?
So he was a healer, I think, for about 2 years on Pine Ridge before he went on the Wild West show. And that was one of the few occupations that survived this very traumatic transition, right? You're always going to have work for healing,
right?
Particularly in this context when there's a lot more people getting sick. And that was how the first way he understood his vision to be enacted, right? And he was the whole life he's trying to figure out, am I following my vision? Am I living up to it? And he did understand that being a healer was the most obvious and immediate thing that he was called to do. Now, the big problem that we're setting up here, right? The missionaries, he hasn't interacted with them yet, but he's going to, is that there were two things you could do as a Native person at this time that would just, us settler folks had no context to handle. Like, it would just blow our minds. Our heads would explode, and we just would try and outlaw it. And one of those things was healing. Mm-hmm. The other thing was dancing. But he, on his own terms, incorporated this idea, this sort of new idea of love that is outside of your own sort of social group. Now, obviously, Lakota people had plenty of love and compassion in their own context. But this is sort of expanding to outsiders, all these new people that are being encountered. When the missionaries do show up, they, along with the government, this is a government policy, they outlaw healing work. And so that sets up a contradiction and a conflict that Black Elk didn't have himself or the Lakota people. And so as we look forward in his biography, that's going to be the major conflict over, do I participate in the church? Do I stay outside because I'm a healer? Do I practice my healing practices underground and try to hide it? Mm-hmm. That's what Native peoples had to face.
Right. And all those things were happening with different people at that time. Mm-hmm. But Black Elk himself had kind of that bullseye where he couldn't do what he was taught to do in his vision, right? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. The healers were on the front line of persecution by all the different levels of authority, whether that's the government or the churches. A lot of times the churches were the people closest on the ground that were trying to enforce this. And so when we look at this bigger question of indigenous people discovering Christianity, and you see that spark, you see that engagement, and then you have the outsiders come in and say, no way, this is what Christianity looks like.
Right.
And that's where we had this major falling out, really, that we're still dealing with.
Damian, thank you once again for joining us here at the Hóčhoka, at the center of the St. Joseph's Indian School campus, where we talk about issues that are central to Native America today. Until next time, everybody stay centered.